Welcome to the Stoner Story Witch podcast. I am Kristyn. Thank you for joining me today. Today's episode is episode 5 of my season on the 2019 film specifically, but really the story of Little Women. In episode 1 and 2, I dove into secure attachment within systems of domination, specifically patriarchy. Is it possible to earn secure attachment within systems of domination, especially across power, rank, and privilege differences? In episode 2, I dove deeper into moments of contact nutrition, which is to say the building blocks of secure attachment, kind of looking at moments of attunement and misattunement just through scenes from Little Women. And then in episodes 3 and 4, I went into some character analysis. Episode 3, looking specifically at each of the March sisters as kind of archetypes or kind of invitations to see ourselves reflected back into them somehow. So I projected myself onto the sisters quite a bit. Same with episode 4, but I looked specifically at more the class differences that are represented in the film. So I looked at the people that are in up power positions economically. So that is Sally and Lori and Mr. Lawrence and Aunt March. In the beginning of Act 2 of Hadestown, we see Persephone come on stage and she's all by herself. And one thing to know about Persephone is that she is a psychopomp. She and Hermes are able to, in Greek mythology, they're able to go to the land of the dead, they can travel freely throughout the realms. So the underworld, the land of humans, as well as the realms of the gods. In the musical Hadestown, she opens up Act 2 with the song Our Lady of the Underground. It is linked all over the fucking place in my show notes because part of that song is the lyrics that I pull for the theme song of the Stoner Story Witch podcast. So if you check out those links, you'll be like, oh, I did not make up those words. Thanks, Aeneas. But as she's singing this song, she gets to a point in the song where she belts out, "There's a crack in the wall." And it's significant because there actually is a wall that is referenced in Hadestown. And it's also important because after she belts out that there's a crack in the wall, the actress, Persephone, or maybe it is Persephone, I don't know, she's a psychopomp. She can travel these realms, and she begins to introduce the band. The musicians that are accompanying her are on stage with her, which I just think is so fucking incredible. And she's actually introducing them as if you were at a concert, right? Anybody who's been to a concert knows that at some point during the concert, at least if it's a good concert, right, the person on the microphone is going to acknowledge who is playing the bass, who's playing the keyboard, who is playing percussion. Like, you go through, and because it's just who all is on stage here, and let's acknowledge them in a way that is not typical in a Broadway musical. But when we recognize that Persephone's role in the musical is connecting the land of the gods with the land of men, and she travels into the underworld, that she's able to travel in ways that all the other characters, aside from Hermes, cannot. She and Hermes are the only people in the musical that ever acknowledge the audience. Hermes is the narrator, but she's talking to the audience directly at the beginning of Act 2. But it's important to really take a step back and see that she is the psychopomp. She is connecting the audience with the story that is unfolding on stage. She's acknowledging that there are musicians accompanying her. And if she's acknowledging that there's musicians accompanying her, she is breaking down the fourth wall. I remember seeing, I'll link it in the show notes, I remember seeing some interview with Anna Kendrick on the Colbert, on Late Night with Stephen Colbert, and she was talking about how, I think she was talking about in Pitch Perfect, he referred to Pitch Perfect as a musical, and she's like, well, actually it's not a musical, and he was like, wait, what do you mean? And she explains that in a musical, it's not acknowledged that people are singing. It's like the songs actually advance the plot, and nobody is actually acknowledging that they are singing. But Pitch Perfect is a movie about musicians, right? The movie is about people singing. The songs that they're singing are not necessarily advancing the plot in any sort of meaningful way. And so if I take that into account that, okay, here we have this musical, and inherent in the beginning of this Act 2, we have Persephone acknowledging, hey, check out these people. Like, these are the people who are accompanying me. I am admitting to you that I am up here on stage and I am singing, and these are the people who are accompanying me. That is breaking down of the fourth wall. And the fact that it comes right after she says that there's a crack in the wall, it feels as if it is, see that these people on stage with me have real names. She's introducing them by their real names. And you in the audience, you have real names. Can you see that there's a crack in the wall? Can you see where the lines are blurred between what is this story, what is this musical, and how does this resonate in your life? Where do you see these themes play out in your life? And to me, asking the audience to find the crack in the wall is to acknowledge that story is an invitation for liberation. So that is the whole fucking reason why this episode is titled Crack in the Wall. It is the reason why I pulled from that song for the theme song for the podcast. And it feels so lovely and invigorating to be able to take a moment and really explain that here now. So in today's episode, I'm really looking at how are stories spells for liberation? How are they cracks in the wall? How do they enable us to get a different view of our own lives through these stories that might take place in different times, different worlds, as well as how are they invitations to liberation? What does it mean to say that story is prophetic praxis? I am going to talk a little bit about unschooling and a couple of the themes that really resonated to me, specifically regarding Amy's experience in school with her teacher. It's such a small part of the story that we see, but just, considering the lens that I am watching this movie from as a former public school teacher, with the invitation to see some cracks in the wall, that was something that just felt really juicy for me to take some time. So I'll be talking about that. I will also really be diving into creative practice as a liberation practice. And I will be diving into Hadestown themes. I think what I'm really trying to identify here is like maybe what are the components of stories that are invitations to liberation that are easier to see some cracks for liberation than others. And so what do those things have in common? What are the archetypal connections? That's a question that I'm just still exploring. That's kind of what this episode is all about. When I first wrote this podcast episode, I really wanted to dive into what I felt was just a really unique opportunity that we have when we are engaging with, in particular, stories that are period pieces, and the extra kind of distance that we're able to get from the story, and how that can make it easier for us to be able to reflect on our own lives, because we're looking at it from an outside perspective inward, that there's like enough different that it's able to kind of subversively inform our everyday. I was really struggling with how to say it. There's a little bit of synchronicity that's happening with me this week as I'm sitting here talking about prophetic praxis and what is it that my relationship to stories can actually do for me. Like, what is the actual technology that stories are providing? I received a Substack newsletter from Sophie Strand, who I will also link to in my show notes. And it was such a nourishing read. I'm going to offer as best of an overview of what she says and how I feel it relates to this. but it's her July 3rd, 2024 issued Substack called Disappearing Stars and Fake Realism. And she starts by talking about how as a child she'd be in this practice of gazing up at the night sky and kind of blurring her gaze, and she could see stars. But then if she tried to actually focus her eyes on a particular star, it would disappear. She was thinking at the time, she kind of related it to like, oh, it's like how you want to approach a cat. Like if you just want to if you want to go directly at a cat to pick them up, they're going to run away. But if you kind of like look to the side, pretend you're not even looking at them, you can approach them from behind and then you can pick them up. The way she puts that is way more eloquent than my overview here. But she then talks about that she learns that it's, about the shape of the eye and the parts of the eye. And then she talks about how as a writer researching for her next book, she's just reading all this nonfiction and she's like, but I need actual stories. I need some fiction. I need something that's going to nourish me and remind me why I write. And it's because I love to read and how going through the process of becoming a writer and the courses she took. And she says that in school, her professors exposed her to lots of art that made her who she is. But she also kind of walked out of that with this belief that popular stories like fantasy and romance are, she says, lowbrow and of a diminished nutritional content. The assumption was that the more immediately popular and accessible your work, the more likely it was not of literary value. That those books aren't, she says, quote unquote, real, that they are junk food escapism. But then she talks about how, she's trying to read all these, kind of elite novellas, and they're just like leaving her more and more malnourished. She says that finally she went to the bookstore and bought the popular books, the smut, those best-selling books that she says are not set in New York City with these relatable, disenchanted millennials. They're not, quote unquote, real. Most often they're set on Mars, or in what Ursula K. Le Guin calls the generalized otherworld of fantasy, Elfland. They struck me as being infinitely more real than most of what was passing as realist fiction. And then Sophie Strand continues that it's in those books that she starts to recognize herself, that there's people and worlds that took stories and feelings and pain seriously, that these protagonists are grappling with morality and illness and violence and disempowerment, grappling with embodiment and desire, and that it's in the romanticides that she finally remembers how revolutionary female desire can be when it's articulated without the stricture of what it is to be good literature. And then she says, I thought again of those disappearing stars. What if when we look directly at our lives disappear? But that fantasy and sci-fi approach from the rods, from the periphery. And Sophie says, I think because they take this oblique approach, they often get much closer to the real than our cone-centered realism gets. So what is more real? A novel with no plants, no ecological texture or consideration, and 3 depressed imaginary 20-somethings having bad sex? Or an epic story of heroism and animism set in the world with talking trees and many different diverse characters? Rods or cones, stars or no stars? And then she says, we live in a moment when stories about good and evil and dragons and space travel may actually be a better way of seeing the stars than trying to stare directly at them. How do we write about hyperobjects like climate change and fascism and extinction and capitalism? We must use our rods, our imaginative peripheral vision. The issues we face exceed our sensory apparatus. They are too big for our direct vision. We must instead approach them like cats, like stars, from the side and from behind. And so while Little Women is not romantasy, it's not sci-fi, it is a period piece. And I think what I'm trying to get at is it's hard for us to look directly at our lives and be able to see some of these themes, but that through a period piece, it can kind of give us that sort of sideway glance into the actual realness that's actually nourishing, that's actually going to fuel us for what it is to live during these times of ecological collapse and late stage capitalism. All right, so now that I have laid out how stories can kind of give us a different angle with which we can look at our own lives and the context of the world that we occupy, I want to zoom out a little bit more. That if we're thinking of stories as spells for liberation, then what comes to my mind is that stories offer us a prophetic praxis. And so when I say prophetic praxis, I am pulling from my teacher, Rev. Angel Kyoto Williams, who has the 5 pillars of liberation that she talks about. And I will definitely continue to link to her in my show notes. A couple years ago, I did a roadmap to liberation offering that I believe she offers every October. So something to look out for. But the 3rd pillar of liberation is prophetic praxis. And I will read just a little segment to kind of provide a little bit of context for what I mean, that period pieces are prophetic praxis. So Rev. Angel writes, "Prophets name the truth of now. The truth is often one that remains hidden or unrecognized, so the message can seem like a prediction. Prophets are often so attuned to the truth of the present that it seems like they are foretelling what is to come. We do not recognize that what they name is already present. As individuals and as a society, we tend to hold onto the past with a hollow nostalgia. The practice of prophetic praxis orients us to what is, invites us to see and name the now, and through this action offers transformation. This is difficult inner work, and by naming what we notice, we develop the capacity of our own inner observer and the courage to tell the truth of the now, starting by telling the truth to ourselves." What that really evokes in me is the invitation that we allow ourselves to question, where is there prophecy? Where is there a nonfiction in this fiction work? If we engage with any sort of story, and I think in some ways, especially period pieces or sci-fi works of story that are pretending to kind of be in an alternate world, but actually receive them as if they are truth, as if they are some mirror, as if they're actually allowing us to see our inner selves, to see the truth of this moment, even if the timeline of the story is way in the past or way in the future or what have you. So instead of thinking that us versus them, good thing I'm not the characters in these stories. How am I actually these characters? How are they me? If this story were in my context, who do I want to be? If this story were made within the context of the 2024 and the world that we're currently occupying, what would those characters be up to? Right? What social taboos is Jo committing? What injustices is she rallying against? Curious. What pronouns Jo would be using in 2024? As a recovering public school teacher, I taught I was a high school biology teacher for about 11 or 12 years. And I've been out of the classroom now for a few years. I would still identify that I am a public school teacher in recovery, which I suppose I can get more into at another time. But with that as a relevant identity to how I view this story, I was very intrigued at the scene in this movie at Amy's school where the girls are talking about the war. These girls are having a really rich conversation, maybe even kind of a debate. You hear them saying things like, let them keep their labor. It's unjust. Why should only the South be punished? Somebody even says, you marches benefited as much as anyone else. So, first off, this is just grade A grappling that I love to see. When I think of grappling, it's like, it's the practice of being in paradoxes, of kind of a practice of breaking out of binary thinking, rights and what's right and wrong and black and white, and noticing that there's trade-offs or noticing like or just like not and in this case this grappling is, you know, like not a quick move to innocence. It is holding the tension that those questions are inviting. And they're not ashamed of saying those things. And in that context, I mean, of course, again, on the outside, we can be looking in and being like, oh, but clearly, like, slavery, like, again, that's our context. It's like, oh man, how do they not know? But then just thinking, like, what are those conversations that are happening currently that we are maybe not encouraging our students to talk about in schools? There is a very big push against teaching accurate history. That is going on in the United States right now. And it is this wanting to coddle to the feelings of white students specifically so that they don't feel bad. A reasonable feeling of shame, like an actual, I would say, like humane response to the moral injury of living in this time. So let's just not talk about it. And the kids are having these conversations in school anyway. I love this moment. Even if it is just snuck in as almost background banter within this larger context of the plot point, which is Amy gets assaulted by her teacher because she drew a picture of him. But of course, this conversation, for me, in my opinion, is one that any good teacher would be thrilled to observe within their classroom. Thrilled to be able to facilitate. At least the type of teacher that I would want to be. And the trend in education, in my experience, from where I'm standing and from what I'm reading, is not headed in that direction. Let's focus on the fact that there is really high level critical thinking and social awareness that is being demonstrated by these girls in these whispers, while they presumably are supposed to be working on some wholly boring rote memorization all by themselves. You can kind of see in the background that like the people who are like doing what they should be doing are like sitting quietly at their desks, working on their own, not being in community. That is, we teach and practice hyper-individualism in mainstream public schools in the United States. That is the status quo. And in this scene, these girls are yearning to just like be in this community and have a conversation. It is this crowding around Amy that's the thing that brings the teacher over in the first place, to see that she's not doing what she should be doing, and not just that, drawing an offensive picture of him. don't believe that the teacher hit Amy because she was being off task. I believe that he hit Amy because his ego is so delicate that he could not tolerate being the target of student mockery via her drawings. And that is a thing that took me a really long time to really let sink in as a teacher, as a white woman teacher who's trying to unlearn my colonial programming and be an educator rooted in liberation. Because being a teacher inherently puts me in a position of power over. I have power over my students, especially in a public school in the United States. I remember shortly before I burned out being really frustrated. I felt this yearning to, my inner Mr. Lawrence, right? Be one of the good ones. I wanted to be a teacher that my students could trust and have their back. And yet, my white woman body will inherently, instinctively be perceived by the bodies and in the bodies of my students. Most of my students were not white-bodied. They will perceive me as more powerful than them, because I am. In these overlapping systems of oppression, I have power over them, and as a paid employee at this school, like the way, and I talked about this a little bit with Aunt March and the way that she was around Amy, the way that our society treats kids and the way we teach kids is giving adults, is teaching kids that to have less power than those in authority, priming them for fascism, in my opinion. Maybe that's going a little far for this episode. More on that later. I have more power than them in this system, in addition to the fact that my role as an adult and as an employee granted me power over all my students, even the white-bodied ones. And I started to realize that when my students would rightfully protest, and this could be an organized protest. My school actually had a very active SOAR group, which is Students Organizing Against Racism. So they would have, planned protests. Okay, 4th hour, they're going to do this thing. There also were just really small scale protests. I had many students that would protest by just not coming to my class. And I see now that every opportunity was a chance for me to choose how to respond. That my education at that point had taught me that it reflects poorly on me as a teacher if my students refuse my class. My education and all my professional development trained my ego to be delicate to that offense. Somebody is misbehaving or protesting in some sort of way, and let's say Amy's protesting by drawing this picture of her teacher. Okay, and I never hit a kid. So I never assaulted a child physically. And I am certain that for the many years that I was not a liberation-focused teacher, I was not a safe haven or a secure base for my students. And I also, as I was gaining liberation and attachment, knowledge, and ways of viewing the world, I was starting to understand the ways that I could let school be a playground of the real world. And that just like how we would host elections for student council or even presidential elections, or try to encourage students to embody letting their voice be heard, providing ways for students to practice protest is a monumentally important learning experience. Them joining some protest is worth skipping out on my previously scheduled mitosis lab. And I also recognize that I could be a liberation-minded educator by allowing myself to be a symbol of the larger systems of oppression due to my power, rank, and privilege over them. That I could actually enter the role of a villain, a safe enough villain, for them to practice rising up against. This is the lens of a teacher who has been out of the classroom for a few years. I was not able to do it. I wish I could have done it. I wish I hadn't left when I left. I wish I could have stayed. But for too many years, I had been taught that we need to prepare kids for the real world, which meant punishing them for their transgressions harder and sooner, rather than preparing kids to create and fight for the world that they would prefer. A liberated future that maybe my limited imagination can't even fathom. Like, that's the role. That's my role as a teacher. And I have unpacked a lot of shame around the moral injury of having been a teacher in that power over role with the lack of awareness that I had for as many years as I had. Shortly after I quit, I wrote a blog post about being a recovering teacher. I haven't read it lately. Maybe I'll link to it. It is a thing I've been grappling with. I still am. And I do miss it. I miss holding sacred space for teenagers, for people kind of on a threshold. People really trying to make sense of the world. And I hope to someday step into a facilitator, teacher, guide role for that type of space holding. And sitting in the question of, is there a school that would have me? So I also want to name that it is a privilege to be able to question your kids' school, like the March family did, right? It's a privilege to be able to change schools. There is privilege to unschooling or homeschooling. When I think of unschool, I have to recommend Akilah Richards' book and podcast and TED Talk, just Raising Free People by Akilah Richards, was another really pivotal work of mine as I was on this liberation journey as a teacher. I can't say enough how happy I was that Marmee did not doubt Amy's story. She didn't assume that Amy was full of shit and be like, well, you had it coming, which I have seen and experienced times when parents have not trusted their kids, the times that, and as a teacher, I appreciated when parents would trust me over their students. And now I'm really seeing the value of parents who maybe could be curious with the teacher of what happened, but trusted inherently that my kid's experience is true. the truthiness of what happened doesn't change that, like, that this was the impact. I don't care how mad that teacher was. You know, I had a kid. I'm glad that, that Marmee didn't blame Amy for drawing those pictures. She never made her apologize to her abuser. Marmee did all these things that I would say, you know, a good, supportive, secure parent should be encouraged and praised to do. So I'm sure there's a lot more that I can say about this. I will just sum up that as a former teacher, I was really glad to have this scene in Little Women to help me reflect on how is this type of education still happening? How can I invite in more liberation? Where is the crack in the wall here for me? So as I mentioned earlier, we see that Meg marries John. She has this crisis of faith, maybe a desire for more, and ultimately ends up committing to choosing John again. I think I touched into it a little bit archetypally, that it's this lovers to devil when we talk about the tarot. And this is shown in Hadestown between the characters Orpheus and Eurydice. And there's this song that is the wedding song, where it is ultimately this lover's moment where Eurydice is, you know, kind of weighing this decision of, does she stay with Orpheus, knowing that it's going to be a little bit harder. He is, you know, he's not a rich man. And then conflict comes. In Hadestown, it's this, you know, I would say climate and ecological disasters due to the insatiable hoarding of the capitalist class. And Eurydice ultimately abandons Orpheus. He's working really hard to try to get the things that he wants for her, and she can't do it. There's more to say about that, but she leaves and he comes back to her. There's this song in Hadestown where Eurydice, because she's gone down to Hadestown, because she's gone to the land of the dead, she's in this field of flowers. She's in the ground. And in this moment, she has actually forgotten her name. She's forgotten who she is. And then Orpheus comes back, and she's able to recommit to him, and they're able to leave Hadestown together. No spoilers right now. Meg and John's story conveniently kind of stops being told at that sweet moment of reconnection and recommitment, so we don't get to see what their next brush with tragedy will be. But again, like if on a longer time horizon, every story changes. Okay, so the next sub-theme of today's episode is creative practice as a liberation practice. When the girls are discussing their creativity, we have Meg, the actor, Beth, the musician, Amy, the artist, Jo is the writer. We find that Jo and Amy both aspire to share their art with the world, and there is this desire to be the best. And Beth says something profound in that moment, which is ultimately the key to Jo's success in the end, quote unquote success, and, you know, capitalist success as well. And Beth says, "My music is just for us." And on the beach before her dying time, she asks Jo to keep writing, to do it for me, for us, even after she dies. And certainly this is Beth's yearning to matter. It is a bid for secure attachment, to know that she will continue to be seen, continue to be loved, continue to be remembered in her death. And just for us, just for me, that is the key. Jo loses Beth, and she remembers Beth's plea for Jo to keep writing, just for us. We see Jo awaken in the middle of the night. She sees Beth's empty bed. She gets her writing, all those clippings and pieces that we imagine she was hoping to sell to Mr. Dashwood, and she burns them. Just like Amy burned her book as a child. It is this ritualistic way that she is marking, I am recommitting to my practice for myself. And we see this return to her writing ritual. She puts on her writer's coat. She goes up to the attic. She opens her desk. She lights the candle. She dips in her pen. And she begins. And she just succumbs to letting the story flow through her. Letting her body be the vessel of what needs to be poured into the world. And it is worth repeating that Marmee is bringing her food and company and safe touch and a shared rhythm during this time. Jo is alone, but she's not languishing in her loneliness. She's deep in her purpose. And this is some underworld journey that changes Jo. We see her negotiating the terms with Mr. Dashwood as herself. When she's done writing, she's laid back in the chair, so goddamn fucking secure in herself and her book. And he insists, perhaps, with whatever good reason, that the heroine needs to be married in the end for people to like it. That people would rather her be married than to be consistent. And Jo relents that marriage is an economic proposition, even in fiction, but she's determined that she will own her own book and not sell out their family story to the limited imagination of the patriarchy. And so I believe the point of this movie is for us to see this glaring crack in the fourth wall, that just like Persephone does in Hadestown, Little Women does it here. It's separating our world from the world of the story. This whole movie is about Jo's struggle in getting this story out, and the ways that even in the end she had to sacrifice like the biggest part of who she is. Like that is her biggest plot point, is it feels like say choosing her liberatory creative practice instead of the status quo, that it's better to be loved than to do what you love, was like the crux that she was at. She said no to Laurie for a reason. That sometimes the story that wants to come out is not the story we get to see, that we get to read. But if we believe that stories are invitations to liberation, we can just be like, hey, wait now. How might Mr. Dashwood, how might a personification of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy have infiltrated how this story got to be told? So let's not separate our world from the world of the story. Can I meditate on the story to see what the story is actually trying to teach? If only we had the ears to hear and the eyes to see. Is it true that there's some part of me that has been conditioned to want the heroine to be married in the end? Is there a little part of me that's comforted with that alternative ending because of the ways that the patriarchy has conditioned me that it's not okay to see a woman alone in the end of the movie because it somehow must mean that she's lonely? So when we look at Little Women as well as Hadestown being stories that relate creative practice as a liberation practice, I think it's really important that I give a little bit of context of what Hadestown has, and I've drawn out here the shape of stories. I think I mentioned that in some earlier episode, how Kurt Vonnegut has drawn out kind of the shape of stories. When I'm drawing out the shape of the story, if I'm looking at Orpheus and Eurydice and then also Joe, and I think of, the y-axis as being, the top of it being, things are going well, and the bottom are things are not going great. And then that middle line, I almost am thinking of what are the moments where they cross that line? And I think of it as moments when the characters are connected to their creative self. One of the reasons why I can't do a Hadestown podcast yet is because I oscillate between if we look at Orpheus and Eurydice, I can't decide who the creator is and who is the muse. I think I can look at it in some contexts and think that, Orpheus is clearly the writer, and Eurydice is his muse. But then I can also look at it with a different lens where Eurydice, or maybe what if Orpheus just doesn't even exist? What if Orpheus is a personification of her creative practice, and her ability to touch into and practice is inhibited by capitalism, by climate catastrophe. Anyway, so just to give a little bit of context, because I'm assuming that most people have probably not watched Hadestown or listened to the songs, but I will say that the character Orpheus, he has a song that will bring the world back into tune. He is actually a character. He is the only character that actually sings in Hadestown. He has a lyre that he plays, and he sings, and his song will bring the world back into tune. There is this la 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 that he plays. There's this melody that is only the only lyrics are ever this la 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 la. Again, you will notice that that is also incorporated in the Stoner Story Witch song. But when he sings it, even in the middle of winter, a flower will appear. And it's like, it kind of, at first it seems like this really cool party trick, and he makes this flower appear out of nowhere, and that kind of is the thing that like convinces Eurydice that like, okay, like this guy's not full of shit. And his relationship with Eurydice is one where she inspires him to finish his song, but ultimately, as he's trying to finish it, climate catastrophe and capitalism comes in. Hades finds Eurydice, and she's in this really tough position. He brings her to the underworld with him. She technically chooses it, but we can remember that in late stage capitalism, there's an absence of good choices. So she doesn't really have any good choice. Orpheus then follows Eurydice. He follows her into Hadestown. And it's actually in this process of losing her and finding her again that he actually gains the experience to finish that song that he originally set out to sing. And in the process of singing that song, he realizes the ways in which he and Hades are one and the same. That Hades deals with this like seasonal abandonment by Persephone in very much the same way that Orpheus felt the abandonment by Eurydice. He needs to sing this song to Hades, and Hades actually won't even listen to the song until Persephone basically like threatens him with divorce. is like, no, like, God damn it, Hades, listen, like you need to hear this boy's song. because the melody that he's singing is like the original song of love of the two of them. And ultimately, Orpheus, quote unquote, wins and is able to bring Eurydice back with him. But Hades, of course, puts conditions on that victory. He says that Eurydice must follow Orpheus out. They can't walk side by side. And of course, doubt comes in. And we all know that it's a very sad ending to the Orpheus and Eurydice saga. If we relate Orpheus to Joe, if we say that Joe is Orpheus, then who is Eurydice? We could say that Eurydice is Beth, right? That Joe has a story that will give Beth some immortality, will bring her back. Like Joe is wanting to bring Beth back, and the only way that we can bring people back is by telling their story. And that she's earning that secure attachment with herself, with her sisters, making their lives matter in the midst of patriarchy that's going to tell you that nobody's going to fucking care. And fucking similar to how Hades doesn't want to listen to Orpheus's song, we have Dashwood who like reads her story and is like, yeah, sorry, this is bullshit. Like nobody's going to want to read this. And how Persephone makes Hades listen to it. It's Dashwood's daughters that find the manuscript and are like demand of their father that they want to read the rest of the novel. And then like that's the only like reason that Mr. Dashwood ultimately ends up giving Joe the book deal. And again, just like Hades, he's like, yeah, so like you've won, here's a book deal, but come on, like we need to have the heroine needs to be married in the end. Orpheus wins. They get to leave Hadestown. However, Eurydice has to follow behind. Yeah, you can like publish your book. However, like the most defining characteristic of who you are, you need to change for your character needs to be married. The whole fucking point of who Joe is like needs to be sacrificed on like the altar of like what we think the public is going to want. So there's that. I also think it's possible that we can look at the story of Hadestown from Eurydice's perspective. We see that at the beginning of Hadestown, Eurydice is disillusioned by the world. She's kind of on her own. She is kind of this, I would say, very stereotypical, like avoidant attacher, like everybody's just gonna leave you, like I'm on my own, it's better this way. But then she connects with Orpheus, and I like to think that Orpheus is a reconnection to her creativity, is a connection to her wildness. I like to sometimes listen to Hadestown and think, is Orpheus even really a character, or is he just an archetypal connection to something greater? Not to go crazy off onto a tangent, but I was just watching some YouTube thing. I'll see if I can find it and link it, about manic pixie dream girls, and how manic pixie dream girls are often this like one-sided or, you know, like two-dimensional character that's just like so quirky and whimsical. And the person that produced it was saying how, you know, the problem, a lot of the discourse on manic pixie dream girls is that, you know, like they're two-dimensional, but they are just written that way. And that the real problem is that they are viewed through the lens of the stale white Wonder Bread boy. That it's like, if instead of like calling women manic pixie dream girls as if that's a problem, to be like, why are there so many stale white Wonder Bread boys that are like desperate for a manic pixie dream girl to come and like reconnect them with their vitality or their I don't know, creative practice. Makes me curious to just kind of put a pin in this and just be like, how is the manic pixie dream girl maybe just like an archetypal connection to like something greater? What if it doesn't actually exist? So I just wonder if Eurydice somehow connects with Orpheus, reconnects with some part of herself, or a larger muse, an animistic connection to nature and her creativity, her wildness, but that she has to sell out, because that's fucking what you have to do in capitalism, period. Like you do have to feed yourself. You do. So what happens if she actually then sells out? So just like I said, how Orpheus is the only character that we acknowledge in Hadestown that sings, there is one moment in Hadestown where it is acknowledged that Eurydice has a song. And there is a song where Hades, the moment when Hades finds her and wants to bring her to Hadestown, he calls her a little songbird. We are led to believe that there is probably a moment where Eurydice is humming or singing the song, most likely Orpheus's song. And that Hades kind of hears it and is like, hey, I'm going to bring you down to Hadestown. You're going to shine like a diamond down in the mine. You're like, hey, little songbird, like, let's bring you down. Promising her comfort, saying that, telling her how hard it's going to be to try to survive in the land of men, and convincing her to come down. And I just think if we think of Orpheus as her creative practice, maybe she is a musician and maybe she's reconnected to, maybe she's creating this song. If Orpheus is not a person and he's a song and she's sitting there and she's humming and she's trying to work, and then she has, this rich embodiment of capitalism coming in and being like, hey, that's a nice little song you got there. She sells out. She says, okay. She goes down into Hadestown. She gives into the capitalist pressures, really hard, only hard choices in capitalism. And she goes to Hadestown under these false illusions. And she realizes that part of the deal is that she has to forget who she is. She has to forget where she came from, everything that came before. The only thing that she's left with is this vague memory of flowers. There's a song in Hadestown about flowers, and remembering that the song that Orpheus had was one that's going to bring the world back into tune, and was able to make flowers bloom where there is nothing. And eventually she is able to reconnect to Orpheus. She is able to reconnect to that creative spark. They are able to, win, quote unquote, over Hades. And then of course, there's still stipulation. That could be, okay, fine. Yeah, you can do your creativity the way you want to do it. But, Meta's algorithms are going to silence you. Or, there's just so much noise out there. Nobody's really going to hear you. So, okay, fine. Yeah, do it. But you're going to be suffering under this weight of hyper individualism, and just shouting into the void of all the noise and all the algorithms of these capitalist systems that are going to just try to silence you. So Hadestown is heavy. But if we think of Eurydice in terms of Little Women, we see that Eurydice is Joe, and the Orpheus is her writing practice. And in the arc of Joe's story, we see how she goes from, as a child and in her childhood, she's creating all these stories that, her sisters are helping to act out and produce the props for and write the music for. I mean, these plays that the March Sisters produce are really a co-production of all their creativity, that there's this extra zhuzh when all four of them are put together, and they're putting it out for their family and for their community. They're offering it freely. And Joe's like, okay, rubber meets the road. I better go try to make it as a writer, and trying to cross that threshold into creating work that the world is going to care about. That's when we see that she gets the soul sucked out of her little by little, from Dashwood, from Friedrich, from losing Beth, losing Lori. And it isn't until she really hits that rock bottom that she finally does realize that what she's been missing and what she's been so bereft of is just the practice itself. is the love of doing it and who you are doing it for. What are you doing it in service of? And when she's able to let all of that click into place, she's unstoppable. She dons the jacket, dips the pen, lights the candle, and she goes to fucking work. And she's unstoppable. She hardly rests, but for, Marmee coming up to just give her a little cuddle, give her some food, and just kind of like I say, it is just like this beautiful moment that she is just seen and held, and her body is nursed as she is creatively, like, it feels like she's in labor. It feels like she's in labor, and Marmee is bringing her like the little ice chips and, like maybe like dabbing the sweat off of her brow, metaphorically speaking, but she's stuck upstairs until this creative project is finished. It's so beautiful. I would like to take a moment and discuss a little more about Orpheus. And I'm going to pull from the book, The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine by Sophie Strand. So the same author of the Substack with the Disappearing Stars. But this is a chapter of her book that I have been holding very dearly to as it relates to Hadestown, certainly as the character Orpheus. So in chapter 12 of The Flowering Wand, Sophie Strand writes, "I wasn't surprised to discover that Orpheus had never really been a single mythological character. Aristotle and his contemporaries regarded the poems attributed to Orpheus as being authored by many different writers. Modern studies of classical texts and traditions have substantiated this perspective. Orpheus is plural. Rather than naming a specific heroic individual, Orpheus appears to have been used more as a spiritual title. You didn't pray to Orpheus, you prayed as Orpheus. Through lyric and poetry and ecstatic worship of the natural world." And then she continues on the next couple pages. "I think Orpheus offers us, men, women, non-binary, lichenized beings that we all are, a novel opportunity. He shows us that we need not immediately speak. First, we should listen. We should listen with our feet, our ears, our minds, and our desires. In order to be an Orpheus, we must be quiet and journey to the blind purple center of our own hearts. We each have our forest of connections that constitute our specific fruiting body. Orpheus asks us to go outside and take off our shoes, and he asks us, what will we provide a mouth for? Each of us is invited to mushroom into our own Orpheus. What stings our blood with an emergency of song?" And then she continues on another page. "Interestingly, in some of the myths, Orpheus does in fact succeed in saving his dead wife. What is important is not Eurydice's resurrection so much as Orpheus's ability to surrender himself to an act of grief that transforms time, opens the underworld, and finally drives other people so mad they must tear Orpheus apart and scatter his body as compost for the soil of a future springtime. His song serves three purposes: to celebrate what is lost, to move through mourning, and to agitate the listening audience into relational action." And then at the end of the chapter, Sophie writes, "Every mode of the masculine has a lyre, a mode of communication. What is yours? In an age of ecological crisis, we need poets and artists to shed the fictional constraints of sterile individuality. We need musicians to sing the song of every small being, to remind us intimately that every melody, although its vibrations travel the air, has emerged from the Orphic world of mycorrhizae and vegetal roots." So all of that to say that Jo as an Orpheus, mourning what is lost, moving through the grief, and calling us all into some sort of relational action, that it is through the metabolism of those feelings that then you're creating some song that is then going to honor what is lost and hopefully call in others to be able to feel it as well, to be able to tap into what they have lost, help them through their mourning, help them to sing their songs. And it goes right back to the without inner change, there can be no outer change, and without collective change, no change matters. Jo has to start with herself, with her immediate family, make it matter. And she puts it out there. The book is her metaphorical song. I have more to say about Orpheus, but I will leave it there. All right, and finally, we have why we build the wall. Even Anais Mitchell won't say much about writing this song. But I would say that this song sums up Aunt March's worldview. The lyrics are kind of this call and response between Hades and the workers, the workers whose labor he exploits for his profit. But he says, why do we build the wall? We build the wall to keep us free. How does the wall keep us free? The wall keeps out the enemy. Well, who do we call the enemy? The enemy is poverty. Because we have and they have not. Because they want what we have got. The enemy is poverty. We build the wall to keep us free. That's why we build the wall. He says, what do we have that they should want? We have a wall to work upon. We have work and they have none. And our work is never done. The war is never won. The enemy is poverty. We build the wall to keep out the enemy. The wall keeps us free. That's why we build the wall. Aunt March is so lonely in that big house. Those walls around her, keeping her protected from feeling a part of her community, a part of her own family. This is a theme that Hadestown explores deeply with Hades and Persephone. I think I said enough about this in episode 4, about that aspect of the wealth wound. But I also just want to plant just a little seed here too, that as I meditate on that song from Hadestown about building walls, I think often about the walls of my own house. The difference of when I was on my wilderness quest, I just had a tarp. I didn't even have a zippered wall like a tent. I didn't have that sense of being able to close myself off from nature. In what ways do our walls keep us as humans disconnected from our essential selves as nature? I took a rewilding course with Peter Michael Bauer a couple years back, and he really talked a lot about the history of agriculture. And I'm currently reading Liberated to the Bone by Susan Raffo, and she even has a section on just this idea that I keep coming back to, and it is that agriculture is this early tribalist thinking, us versus them. It's colonialism. It's dominating and decimating the land and the resources for us, which is to say our species. Putting up fences so that these are my tomatoes, not the rabbits and not the deer. That agriculture and power over the dominating of the land that is wounding us from our interconnectivity with all living things. And I just want to name that importance here, and that this is a deep theme of the podcast. I want to just remember that when we think of Stoner Story Witch as answers to questions, or a process, a step 1, 2, 3. That Stoner is about the practices and perhaps plant medicines that connect us to our own wildness. Where are the cracks in those walls? In what ways have I been taught that I need protecting, or I need walls? And in what ways are those walls actually keeping me from what I need the most? I will be sitting in that question until the day I die, certain. And I'm so happy to have the question. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to whatever episodes you listen to, as I'm trying to figure out what is the framework? What is the Stoner Story Witch call? What is the Stoner Story Witch process? I have one final episode that I will be kind of noodling on. I want to take some time to actually listen to my own podcast back to me and see if there's something new that emerges. I'm not entirely sure what the last episode is that I'm going to be sharing. Aside from that, it's going to just be a little bit of a commentary on what the process of making this podcast is, diving into a little bit more of the process of sourdough that I know I mentioned at kind of the episode 0. And that is, basically it's if I relate this story to my life, if I am Joe, or if I allow myself to be Orpheus and Eurydice, but also acknowledging the ways in which I'm Aunt March and I'm Hades. And if this podcast is my amplification of the song of liberation, how is that unfolding and emerging within my life, within my family, within my most close relationships, within my community? For the sake of what? And why am I doing it? Right? Just like if why is Joe writing if not for Beth? Why am I doing this? What is it for? I think I'll be diving more into that in the next episode, so stick around for that. It has never been my intention that this podcast was going to be a one-sided conversation. I invite you to email me at stonerstorywitch@gmail.com with any connections or questions, or just sharing what resonated with you. In what ways has anything that has been shared on this episode or any of the episodes, how has it fit into your life? It would bring me so much joy to be able to engage with people on this level. I've been aching to have conversations around the themes that I have presented here. And so if there's anybody who wants to pull up a chair and chat with me, either over email or voice memo or whatever feels right. I like Joe, it's pretty lonely sometimes. It can be lonely, and it's my hope that anybody who has listened maybe feels a little less lonely by something that I have shared. And I would love to feel your presence if you wish to share. Thank you so much for listening. And I want to thank Matt Shuby for the podcast art, my husband Kevin Carlo for all his help in the creation of the theme song for the podcast, and Anais Mitchell and John Williams for their inspiration of Hedwig's theme and Hadestown. And before I sign off, I would like to leave you with a quote from another one of my teachers, Rev. Angel Kyoto Williams, who says, "Love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. And without collective change, no change matters."